Welcome to Bible Quest, the New York City, New Jersey, Philly edition. And today, I guess it is not the Harrisburg edition. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's not the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania edition because we don't have Chase Byers with us, but we do have Joe Works with us as always. Good afternoon, Joe.
Hi, Jeff. How are you doing today?
And Drew DeGrotto from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, who is the mastermind behind the Tuesday edition and really has helped me get this Wednesday edition off the ground. Good afternoon, Drew.
Good afternoon, Jeff. Good afternoon, Joe. Good to see both of you.
And since we've got you here, Drew, ever since Noah Andrews left for the summer, he was our webcast engineer. There's not a week yet that I've gotten everything right in trying to get this thing started. And so let me just go through the checklist here real quickly. It is streaming live to Facebook, right?
Yeah, it looks like it is. I'm not on Facebook to check it. I just see it says live on Facebook. Joe, do you happen to see Facebook?
I do not, no.
I just realized I'm still in, I just realized something I forgot to do. On the Zoom app, I have to go from practice mode to broadcast mode. And so the first 30 seconds there, we didn't have that going. But now I've got that going. So that's done. We're unmuted, right? We're all unmuted. Video is all on. Now we need to go to speaker view. And now I think that everything is right. Is that right?
I will just mention to you, Jeff, that I saw Noah's mother a couple of days ago down at the Shore Region congregation and mentioned to her that every episode since Noah has been gone has been
a mess.
It's not gone smoothly, but we're certainly grateful for people like him and Drew, who certainly do a lot to help us with this production.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today, Drew. Today we're going to talk about several topics. We do want to invite our viewers to chime in. And so if you want to send comments by means of the Facebook page, that'll be just great. You know, I forgot to ask who is going to be monitoring the Facebook comments so that we'll get them. Drew, are you able to do that?
I don't have the Facebook.
I'll try to keep an eye on that then. I can toggle back and forth and keep an eye on that. Yeah. So in fact, I'll just set it right now, take a look over there, see if we have any comments to start with, and we don't. But our topics today, we're going to talk a little bit about historical or you know, it was tempting to title this first segment, Bible Characters Known in History. But that title gives me problems. Does that title bother you?
What part of it is bothersome to you, Jeff?
That known in history part.
Okay.
Because that implies that if we only know them from the Bible, they're not known in history.
Yeah, people, agnostics or doubters, haters, if you will often take the position that you cannot use the Bible to verify anything.
Yeah, and so if somebody there's a record of some historical event in the Bible and characters involved in that event, well, we don't know if that really happened or not until we find it in some other source. But it is interesting that as we look at various events in the Bible and various characters, we find a number of them that are mentioned in extra biblical sources that have been verified or have been found in archaeology. Through archaeology or in ancient writings. And this is not, making this point is not to prove that the Bible is the Word of God. That's not what we're doing here. I believe the Bible is the Word of God. You guys believe that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what we're doing here is just making the point that the Bible is not myth. It's not just some made-up stories about made-up characters. It's talking about people who really existed. Maybe you guys have a quick example or two you want to start with that where there's a character mentioned in the Bible or an incident mentioned in the Bible, and there are other sources that also talk about it.
There are some easy ones, maybe just thinking about somebody like Pilate in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus and the trials. And, people want to dismiss that all as just being a legend and so forth. And yet you have Jewish historians like Josephus who reference Pilate as well.
Gallio in Acts 18 from roughly that same time period is another one. When Paul is in Corinth and in Acts 18 and verse 12, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul. in the early half of the 20th century, there was an inscription that recorded the contents of a letter mentioning Gallio as proconsul and the date. So we know the date at which he came to be proconsul fairly close, within fairly close time range. And so that helps us date the events of the book of Acts. Others
I have a couple too, but before I did, you talked about how some people say that, well, you really don't know because it's there in the Bible, but it's not elsewhere. There's a famous archaeologist, I forget his first name, but Ramsey, you familiar with that name?
Yeah, William Ramsey. He was a guy.
That's it.
He was a guy who really did not believe, for example, that what is attributed to Luke, including the book of Acts, was written by a man in the first century. He thought it was written by somebody in the second century, and went over to tour what would be modern day Turkey to show the various errors that he made and what happened. Well,
he ended up proving it that everything that was discovered, Luke was accurate.
He became so impressed with the writings that he said this was written by somebody who was there when Paul was there making these trips through the various cities that are in modern day Turkey.
Now, I don't have his exact quote. I didn't think about this one beforehand, but you can Google and look him up. But he actually made a statement, and I'll paraphrase, something to the effect that, in his opinion, Luke is the most, I don't want to say most accurate, but I think he used the word accurate, historian, using terms of people, cities, things like that in the first century that it has to be there or else it doesn't, in other words, it convinced him that everything Luke said was true.
Yeah, I've got a copy here of his historical commentary on Galatians, and I have some of his other works here. So I grabbed it real quick to see if I could find one of those statements he makes, because he makes some fairly impressive statements. The other people that we find mentioned in the Bible, let me share screen here real quickly. Right there. You guys know what a boola is?
A boola.
Well, let's see here. Do you see a screen that says boola at the top?
Yeah, yes. Boola, yeah.
Okay, all right. So a boola, well, this would be an example of a boola right here. It's a clay, it's a piece of clay that has an impression upon it made by, say, for example, a signet ring that would have the identifying seal of someone, and they could impress it to the soft clay and it would harden. You could use it to secure a scroll, for example. This is one that says belonging to Ahaz, son of Yehotam, which would be Jotham, king of Judah. And so that is the Ahaz who is the king mentioned, for example, in the book of Isaiah and Isaiah chapter 7, as well as in 2 Kings and in 2 Chronicles.
That's impressive.
Isn't that cool? And then this one is interesting to me because I actually saw this one several years ago. This is a boola that is inscribed with the word Shaphan, the son of Gemariah, who is mentioned in Jeremiah 36:10. Now, here's the thing about this one. Shaphan, the son of Gemariah, there could have been a lot of people named Shaphan, and there could have been even several Gemariahs who had sons that were named Shaphan. Joe, you've got a son named Micah. You reckon there are other people who are named Joe who have sons named Micah?
I'm sure that there is somewhere.
I've got a son named Nathan. I wouldn't be surprised if there are other Jeffs somewhere who have sons named Nathan. So why would we think this is the particular Shaphan who was the son of Gemariah who is mentioned in Jeremiah 36:10?
Exactly what I was going to ask you.
Well, that's because you have an inquisitive mind. Inquiring minds want to know. So the thing is, this was discovered in the burnt remains of a house in Jerusalem, and the remains there, the organic materials that had been charred could be dated, and they were dated to the time, the window in which a fairly narrow window in which the destruction of Jerusalem occurred in 586 when the Babylonians destroyed it and burnt everything down. Moreover, Shaphan, let's turn over to Jeremiah 36:10 real quickly. If one of you guys get there before I do, let's read it.
What was that verse again?
Jeremiah 36, verse 10.
Then Baruch read from the book of the words of Jeremiah in the house of the Lord, in the chamber of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan the scribe, in the upper court at the entry of the new gate of the Lord's house, in the hearing of all the people.
So this mentions that he's a scribe. Well, where this boola was found, there were a pile of these boola there. As if, and this is what it's thought it happened, there were a bunch of scrolls, each sealed with one of these boola. And when the fire came, it destroyed all the scrolls, but the boola were left. They weren't destroyed in the fire, and so you just end up with these pile of boola. Who would have a pile of scrolls in his house?
Scribe would.
A scribe. So the circumstances, the location, the date, and then all of that with the coincidence of the son of the father, Shaphan, the son of Gemariah, being the same name as mentioned here in Jeremiah. It is thought this is pretty good evidence. This is probably the boola of this man. Here's one, and it says, belonging to Hezekiah of Ahaz, king of Judah. Well, that has to be that same guy. How many Hezekiahs, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, were there? One. So that's just amazing to me that all these years later, we're talking about something on the order of 2,700 years later, we have this boola here that was from this man.
And to me, one of the things that's kind of neat about those, you have people like David and Isaiah. Maybe we'll get to some of them as well. But some of these fellows are what you would think of as sort of minor characters in the scriptures. They don't play a major role like a Moses or David. And yet we find evidence that even the details in Jeremiah's writings and in the records of the kings, that those were real people.
Yeah, I don't think that Shaphan, the son of Gemariah, is going to be on the entrance exam for heaven. Not that there's an entrance exam for heaven. That's a joke, but okay.
I got some screen I want to share too, but I don't want to interrupt where you're at if you got more.
I'll tell you what. Let me get this. Go ahead. And now
mine jumps forward to the New Testament, first century.
All right. Well, I'll get this in real quickly then.
Yeah.
In 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 13 and following, and also in Isaiah 36, it talks about what happened in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And so this is after the fall of the northern kingdom, and now here comes the Assyrian king into the southern kingdom, and he's threatening them, and he takes a lot of the cities in the southern kingdom. And there was a prism. I believe it's six-sided, if I remember correctly. This is a photograph that either I or my wife took, but you can find pictures of it online. That's my ballpoint online. That's my ballpoint pen right there. So, and that's the band around it. So that's not even the full length of the pen, but that'll give you an idea. This is not all that big a thing, but it's covered with cuneiform text on all the sides of it. And it's a record of the accomplishments of this king Sennacherib of Assyria. And it talks about this same event when he came into Judah. And it says, in my third campaign, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, says, I marched against Hadi-Luli, king of Sidon, whom the terror-inspiring glamour of my lordship had overwhelmed. Sennacherib, maybe not the most humble character that ever lived. He fled far overseas and perished. As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to his strong cities, walled forts, and countless small villages, and conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps and battering rams, brought near the walls with an attack by foot soldiers, using mines, breaches, as well as trenches. I drove out 200,150 people, and so on. So he's boasting about what he did to Judah. Well, the Bible says he took all the fortified cities of Judah. But in 2 Kings 18, it tells about how the king of Assyria assessed Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold during this episode. On the prism, Sennacherib says, Hezekiah himself did send me later to Nineveh, my lordly city, together with 30 talents of gold 800 talents of silver. What do you notice here?
Numbers aren't quite the same.
Numbers aren't quite the same. Now, I guess you could get all hung up on the fact, well, the numbers are different. What is more compelling to me is that you have this same story, obviously the same event, recorded both in the Bible and in Sennacherib's annals. And it's not surprising that numbers can vary from one testimony to another.
Plus, you know how close a 3 could look like an 8?
Well, that's true.
300 versus 800.
Okay, 800 talents silver. 3. Well, 3.
But that, I'm talking English. I got you on that one.
You got me. All right. Yeah.
Hey, Joe, I think this is the last time Jeff's going to ask me into the program.
All right. But there is this little interesting detail right up here. He says, I made him a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. But the prism of Sennacherib never describes the fall of Jerusalem. It never describes his actually conquering Hezekiah. Why not?
Because that's something that he did not accomplish.
He did not accomplish. The Lord smote much of his army. I think he had 185,000 die in one night, and he just packed up and went home.
Are you saying that kings don't brag about their failures?
That's exactly what happened here. All right. Here's another one real quickly, Drew, and then let's turn to what you have there from the New Testament. This is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, and this is in the British Museum in London. I've seen it there. Some of the young ladies from the church here recently were over there and took pictures of it as well, but these pictures I just pulled from the online side of the British Museum. And it has pictorial records of various kings coming and giving tribute to the king of Assyria. And right here in the second panel from the top is a character who is said to be of the house of Omri, and it's usually interpreted that this is Jehu of the house of Omri. Of course, Omri was a king of Israel. Jehu was a subsequent king of Israel. Wasn't actually of the house of Omri, actually destroyed the house of Omri, but he was a successor. And from a foreigner's perspective, you could see him being reckoned as a ruling member of the house of Omri. And so he's bowing down here, giving tribute. What you got? What you got there, Drew?
Okay, let me share my screen.
All right.
It's going to stop you.
Yep, that's fine. I'm stopped.
Okay. Okay, let's go to this one. Now, most people have heard of these guys, I'm sure. Cornelius Tacitus, 1st century, 56-120. You got Lucien of Samosata, and then you have Josephus. But I have some quotes of Luke, and I'll explain about this Alexamenos later, but Cornelius makes a very interesting statement. And if you recall, Cornelius is the one that, Cornelius, he wrote the book called, stop it, everything's going crazy all of a sudden. He wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome, obviously. I think he was a senator, in fact. But anyway, I want to quote something about him. He says, Christus, we know who that's referring to, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, that is crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. We know who these guys are. They're mentioned, right?
Yep.
Then he goes on to say, and a most mischievous superstition, that's what we believe in, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular.
So he was not sympathetic to Christianity.
Not in any sense of the word. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing a city as of hatred against mankind. And in the last part of the mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. So he's talking about events, but he's also mentioning key figures who existed and in the 1st century. And I mean, he's not a friendly guy towards Christianity.
No, No, and he's writing this in the context of the discussion of Rome burning, and Nero was accused of having purposely had fire set to certain parts of the city as kind of an urban renewal project. He could burn those parts down and rebuild more grandly. And so Tacitus is saying that in order to kind of to turn the attention away from others, he was blaming these followers of this Christus or Christus.
Yeah, and it's the most mischievous superstition, so they're worthy of this destruction. And so that's very good evidence for non-believers to have to say, well, was that made up too?
Yeah.
And so just reminding everybody, it's on the screen there, but this is not a historian writing these things. This would be more like a newspaper of the day. He's a contemporary of Paul and Peter and Apostle John and others.
Good point. Very good point.
Yeah, he was a historian, but the point you're making is it's not somebody looking back 500 years saying this. It's somebody who lived back about that time, writing about recent events.
Exactly.
Yeah. He's writing a journal or an article of very current events.
And so I would challenge non-believers or people who doubt these things that are written in the scriptures. I would challenge them to, contact us on the website. Give us some information how this maybe is not true. Think about what this man is saying or had said almost 2,000 years ago.
So if you all have, you who are watching, if you have comments, questions, do send them by way of the Facebook page, or you can use the Zoom app and use the Q&A tab there. But let's move on to something else here.
Let me mention one other thing really quick, if I can.
Yeah.
There is a professor at Purdue University that, for the people who are really interested in this kind of study, I won't pronounce his name correctly. It's Lawrence Mykytiuk. Mykytiuk. Again, he's a professor at Purdue, my father-in-law's alma mater. And he has, through a lot of study, confirmed no less than 53 fairly significant individuals in the Old Testament, many of them kings, going back a great time. And he's got the information. I think it's in the I had it up there a minute ago. Biblical Archaeological Society have some reviews on his work. Seems to be well founded. Some of the things that we mentioned here this afternoon are listed among the things that he has written about at great length.
Hey, before we move on, tell us about Alexamenus there, Drew.
Alexamenus, that's
wild artwork looking there.
Yeah, that's it's a plaster that was historians date this around 200 AD, and it's sitting in the Roman museum. I forget the name of the museum. I have it on another slide, but it's called Alexamenos Graffito. And if you'll notice what it is, it's a man, a human figure appearing on a cross, but he's got a head of a horse.
Uh-huh.
And then there's this other guy that's got his arm up like he's addressing this human figure on a cross with the head of a horse. And what it is, those words are saying, look at Alexamenos worshiping his God.
Yeah.
In other words, what a fool. Alexamenos is a Christian worshiping Christ who died on a cross, and he is being mocked for worshiping this Christ on a cross from pagan I don't know if he's a friend or whatever. And the point I want to make with this is verification that Jesus's reputation was totally destroyed when the Romans nailed him to the cross, which was the purpose of the cross. And obviously believers didn't, when they became a believer, the reputation obviously was no longer destroyed, but the world, Jews and Gentiles, looked at Jesus as something foolish. Definitely the Greeks, the Gentiles, foolishness of the cross. Here's an example from 200 AD of a man being considered mocked for worshiping something so foolish. And then the last one I have is Lucien. His quote is, "The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites." We know he's talking about Christ here. He refers to them as followers of Christ by using the term Christians. who introduced their novel rights and was crucified on that account. We know who he is. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. This guy's telling us a lot. He's recognizing that the man Christ has followers and that they're willing to die because they have this silly notion of immortality. In fact, he says they start with that notion of immortality. Jeff, wouldn't you agree that modern critics would say that people like us, we become Christians and then we're brainwashed into believing over time that we have immortality?
Yeah, I could see people today arguing that, certainly.
This guy living in the 2nd century knows the Christians, and they start with that premise. Anyway.
That says something about the faith, the depth of the faith of the people that he's talking about.
Exactly.
Joe, what was if somebody wanted to look up the information from the professor at Purdue University who had documented some 53 people mentioned in the Old Testament who are known either through archaeological means or ancient historical writings, how would somebody find that information?
Well, there's this thing called the Google. One of the things you can do is Google his name, Lawrence, again, Mykyktiuk, and I think you would find plenty of information from there. Also,
I just stuck in Mykyktiuk, hit enter in the Google search bar, and the first result says Purdue researcher verifies the existence of 53 people mentioned in, and so on.
Yeah. And so that looked like some pretty good material there. I thought it was interesting. He had published back in, I think, 2014, evidence for 50 individuals. And then within 3 years span, in 2017, he added 3 more names to it. I'm not sure which 3 he added. I need to go back and look at that again. But it really seems like it's pretty solid research and current information for us. Again, things that people find in museums around the world. If you have opportunity to travel to London or Rome, places that you all pointed out there.
All right, well, great, guys. Let's move on to another topic here. And to our viewers, what we want to ask you to do is give us examples of things that would illustrate the principle. Sometimes a Christian or a disciple of Jesus Christ has to make a choice and say, I can't participate in something that somebody else is doing. Somebody else is engaged in a sinful activity, and I have to draw a line and say, I won't participate in that. And we're going to talk about some biblical passages, but this comes to mind in the news here recently. Of course, the Red Chicken restaurant, I think it's the Red Hen restaurant.
Right.
They asked Sarah Huckabee, who is the spokesperson for President Trump, asked her to leave because they don't agree with what Donald Trump's administration is doing. And then some people said, well, that's the same thing as when somebody refused to serve or do service for a gay wedding, a baker or a florist or a photographer or something like that. I don't want to get into the discussion of the owner of the Red Hen or Sarah Huckabee or Donald Trump or any of that. But there is a difference that I'm not sure everybody is aware of in saying, I'm not going to do business with somebody who is immoral on the one hand, and on the other hand saying, I'm not going to participate in the immoral activity of someone. There's a difference in those two things, and we need to be prepared as Christians to draw some lines there. There are passages of Scripture that I have in mind. Let's start with these. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. And it says, have no fellowship or have no share or participation. Yeah, Joe?
Ephesians 5:11, I think.
Well, what did I say, 4:11?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ephesians 5:11. Have no fellowship or don't participate in, don't share in, don't have a share with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather even reprove them. I have heard that quoted at times by people who thought that meant I couldn't do anything with someone who is guilty of teaching some false doctrine, for example. That's not what it's saying, but it is saying don't participate in the unfruitful works. If somebody is engaging in some sinful activity, don't get involved in that. And there's a similar statement over in 1 Timothy chapter 5, or a similar point being made in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 22, where Paul writes to Timothy, I think it's verse 22, is it verse 21? 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 21, the last part of the verse, not to be a partaker of other men's sins. And then there's one more passage that comes to mind, and that's Romans chapter 1. And Romans chapter 1 and verse 32, after talking about the sins that characterized the world, and people who are guilty of them, it says in verse 32, who knowing the ordinance of God, they that practice such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but also consent with them that practice them. And so there's something wrong with consenting with something that is wrong. There's something wrong with getting involved in somebody else's sin. There's something wrong with having a share in something that's an unfruitful work of darkness. So what I want to do is talk about, in practical terms, the difference between a principled person being nice to unprincipled people and a principled person participating in the unprincipled activities or participating in the sinful activities. And I really want to drive this home. If we're going to have principles, they've got to mean something to us to the extent that I will not share in what I believe is wrong. And that's an important concept. Guys, comments, thoughts?
Sure. And again, really encouraging anybody who's listening to comment on Facebook or here on the chat. Love to get other feedback on this. To note, as you pointed out in brief there in the Ephesians 5 passage, he gives a list of the kinds of things that we ought not to participate in. I don't think any of these lists to be all-inclusive, but earlier in the chapter, but fornication, all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you as fitting for saints, neither filthiness nor foolish talking nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather of giving of thanks. For this you know that no fornicator, unclean person, or covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. So I think if you just read that chapter, it becomes rather evident the kinds of things that we ought not to participate in would be the kinds of things that he's talking about in those verses.
Yeah. All right. So now let's see if we can give some examples. And the fact is, as we start making application, there are degrees of separation from an activity. And in some cases, we're going to describe an activity and my involvement in it, which would clearly be sharing in the sinful activity. But there are degrees of separation, and I can get so far removed from it that, yes, you can draw a line, you can connect the dots, but I'm really not participating in the sinful activity. And where we draw the line between a remote connecting of the dots and actually sharing in the activity, that's going to involve some judgment sometime. But I have to be willing to make those judgments, even as I have to be charitable of others who may make slightly other judgments. But if we're going to be children of God and lights in this world, we're going to have to make those judgments and apply these principles. So let's start off with some obvious applications, some things where I would obviously be sharing in somebody else's sinful activity. As obvious as you can get. What would be something? And I'm throwing this out to our viewers too. Send us your comments here.
I think it's pretty safe to say that it would be wrong for me to join with somebody in murdering someone else.
Yeah, I think so. If somebody says, I want to go kill this guy, and I say, hey, well, I've got a gun you can use. And by the way, here's some ammunition.
He did say obvious, Joe, and you took him up on it.
That's what I wanted. I wanted obvious.
How about something now less obvious?
All right. Maybe a little less obvious.
A little less obvious, okay.
But the point is here, I didn't kill the guy. but I knew what he was going to do, and I enabled him to do it, even encouraged him, and provided the weapon for him to do it.
What about what do you call the guy that sits in the car? The drive-away guy?
The getaway driver.
The getaway driver. He's not really in the bank.
Some criminal you would make, Drew. Hey, I'll be the drive-away guy. That's right.
But he's not in the bank doing the robbing. He's just sitting in the car waiting to take someone somewhere to go.
But you know, even under U.S. law, if there's a bank robbery and somebody's killed in the bank robbery, other guys who are involved in it can be charged with the murder and convicted of it, even though they didn't pull the trigger. That's
the participating. That's the sharing in the activity.
That's right. And so it is when we start talking about morality. And as Christians, we have certain principles by which we're going to live. And I can't share in somebody else's sin.
Well, what about, here's one maybe less obvious. In today's laws, it's not against the law for same-sex marriage.
Right.
So my neighbor's good friend, I've known him all his life, his son is going to get married to another fella.
Right.
And he's invited me to the wedding. Well, I don't approve of that, but, I want to, what do you think? Should I go to that wedding?
So what you're doing
if you in that wedding?
Yeah, if you go to that wedding, what you are doing is celebrating and participating in the celebration of this homosexual union. And I would have to say that's one where if I'm going to say the union is wrong, I can't go and celebrate it. If I'm celebrating it, I am celebrating somebody else's sin. I'm encouraging it.
My very presence there is showing approval of it.
That's right. That's right. And that's a line, I believe it's pretty clear I need to draw that line. So that brings us to the cases of the bakers and the florists and the photographers who have not refused to take pictures for somebody who's a homosexual. They've not refused to sell flowers to somebody who's a homosexual. They've not refused to sell cupcakes to somebody who's a homosexual, but they've refused to go and do the photography at the wedding, or they've refused to create a cake with two men kissing on the top of the cake and putting their names on it as part of the celebration of the union. I think that's principled people refusing to participate in sinful activity, refusing to consent in the sin.
Well, what about this one? Maybe even less. This one may raise a couple of eyebrows, but something that relates to religious people who have a different belief in a particular doctrine. Baptism.
Yeah.
All right. My family has invited me to go to what they call christenings. And that is where they celebrate the sprinkling on the baby.
And they take a little baby, drop a few drops of water on it, and they say that's a baptism. And
so they said, just come and we're going to celebrate, and it's a good thing. I just wouldn't go. I didn't feel comfortable.
I wouldn't either. I would be perpetuating an erroneous understanding of what baptism is and what becoming a Christian is, and I don't want to participate in that. So, all right, now let me walk you guys through a little scenario. Let me check if we've got comments from our viewers who may have been sending in scenarios, and I don't see anything from any of our viewers right now.
I don't see any on the Q&A.
I've got one from Matt Vaughn is stating here, is associating with or participating with immoral people of the world different than fallen brethren, i.e. church discipline?
There is a difference here to be discussed, and I've got to get rid of my little phone here. I don't know why I don't remember to mute that thing. Okay, so let's get to that in just a moment. Let's get to that distinction in just a moment. But before we get to that distinction, let me walk through this scenario here. Would it be wrong? Is pornography wrong? Is it wrong to put images, sexually erotic, evocative, nude?
Yes.
Pornography wrong.
Yeah. Lusting is wrong.
But so if you're a photographer, it would be wrong for you you're not the model who's getting naked, but can you shoot the pictures and sell them to the magazine?
No, in fact, when I used to do it commercially, I would turn down assignments that included images that would not even be considered pornographic. It was just
in modest, huh? Okay.
In modest,
so if pornography is wrong and it's wrong for the photographer, would it be wrong for a magazine to buy the photos and put them in the magazine and sell the magazine and make money.
Yeah, I mean, if it's wrong to pose and to take the pictures, to distribute those pictures would also be wrong.
Yeah, and so I'm still participating. I'm sharing in the unfruitful works of darkness. Would it be wrong for me to work in the convenience store behind the counter and pull the magazines out for the customer who wants to buy them and sell them to them? I think so, but at some point, we're going to find some difficulties. There's a UPS driver who's responsible for delivering goods to the store. There is a mechanic that repairs the truck that the UPS driver uses to deliver goods to the store. There's the tool maker who makes the tools for the UPS, for the mechanic who repairs the UPS truck who delivers the goods. I don't have a problem with the guy who makes tools, and those tools are used by a mechanic to repair a UPS truck that somebody uses to deliver goods to a convenience store that include pornographic magazines. But somewhere there, I've gone from, if I start at that point, but I progress down that spectrum of possible involvements, I cross a point to where I am sharing in the unfruitful works of darkness. And I need to be willing to make a determination and make application in my life and say, I am not going to do this.
And I think that's what we have to do, is try to find where will our conscience lead us based upon the scriptures, based upon the principles we read. And then also, I think we need to find a good amount of patience with others.
Yeah.
And not draw the exact same conclusion.
That's a good point we need to be getting to, and I know it's getting close to the end of the time, but that is really a good point that to move over to is now, how do we then act in a gentle way to the world?
Mm-hmm. So, and even to other believers who may not draw the line at exactly the same point I do. So, Joe or Drew, you and I may have a difference in exactly where we draw that line. But the fact is, each one of us is going to stand before God, who is the judge of hearts. And he's going to know, was I involved in something I shouldn't have been involved in because I had a financial interest, or because I didn't want to lose friends, or whatever, I wasn't willing to draw the line I should have drawn. God's going to know my heart, and he's going to be the judge of that. We need to be, and I would say this, let's be more willing to draw the line more conservatively than we absolutely think is necessary. Romans 14 says, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. That's Romans 14, verse 23. In that context, faith means being fully assured that it's right. In fact, that's the language that he uses back earlier in the chapter, being fully assured, being fully confident, convinced it's right. So I need to be willing to draw the line where I'm not fully assured that I'm okay, rather than saying, well, I'm not sure I'm guilty if I do this, so I'll go ahead and do it.
And here's a good question that Jim just entered in. It says, so I'm at a conference and there's a social gathering. Once it's over, I decide to attend for a while and socialize with some of the people. There's alcohol there, but I don't partake. Is it wrong for me to attend the gathering even though I'm not drinking? This is a good example of how do we identify that line?
Yeah, that's a good example, and that's one where different people are going to make different judgments. Would it be wrong for me? I go and I socialize with people, and somebody says, "Hey, would you go get me a drink?" Should I go get them a drink?
No, but that's different than what he's asking. You're right. That's different.
Yeah, Joe.
Go get him some water is what I would do.
Go get some. Yeah, you asked for a drink. Here's a drink. Now, depending on the circumstances, we might come to different judgments about just being present under the circumstances. If it's a few people standing around with drinks, but there's a lot of other activities going on, we might come to a different conclusion than if everybody's just drinking away and it's kind of a revelrous affair.
Now, in this particular case, though, the gathering was not for drinking party. The gathering was a social event of the workers or employees and other people that participated in a corporate event. Now they're just finishing that event, and they're going to celebrate and have food, and there are going to be drinks there. So the purpose was not to get drunk. The purpose was not for banqueting or something like that, and to just be drinking, but some are.
And along with Jim's comment, you find, I think that's a very real scenario, and I appreciate that, that question being real time. You have the same thing with going to sporting events, going out to a restaurant where alcohol is served, which most restaurants now, have the option to drink alcohol. So even if your table's not participating in it, it's around you. But again, one of the places where I would draw the line in that is if it's the purpose of coming together, and if those that I am closely associated with are going to be partaking of it, where it's going to look as if I'm approving of it, possibly even engaging in it. That's where I've tried to draw the line based upon these passages. We're about out of time. Let me just reference a couple of the passages. We got some good questions. Probably need to save for next week also.
Yeah.
But maybe 2 Corinthians 6 and 7 comes into play of being unequally yoked in passage and some of those ideas. Also, a passage that people don't think as much about, two of them tied together, Jeremiah 50 and Revelation 17 and 18, in particular Revelation 18:4. I'm thinking in context of the culture of our society, of America today. I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, unless you receive of her plagues." And really, about a political party or a movement in particular, but our culture is very much wanting us to engage and be a part of sins, whether it's materialism or the homosexual movement or whatever. We are being bombarded with a plea to take a position of political stance that we as Christians need to try to avoid.
Yeah, and we are out of time. Let's come back to this next week. We also didn't get to the Sabbath. We need to get back to that next week. Matt's question, we need to get back to that. Karen had a question we didn't get to today. We need to get back to that. But that passage in Revelation 18, there's something very relevant there. So we'll try to come back to those next week. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all those of you who are watching today or listening on the podcast that you may be listening to later on. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.